let me introduce you to Mr. Sobitawul, Dr. Sobitawul. We were discussing this morning about our different profiles and experience, and it came up several times that although we might look relatively dynamic, some of us have a lot of experience, and I guess that's also fit for you, because I was shocked to see that you have over 30 years of experience in our...
I look a little younger.
Everybody looks a bit younger, I guess, so age doesn't count. But anyway, thanks for being here. You have an enormous range of experience. You have been working for the International Red Cross in the early days. You've been working at the Graduate International Institute for Development Studies, from which you are also a graduate for your master's and your PhD. Actually, you worked at NORAG and you worked at the International Institute for Higher Education in Morocco. And so from there, I understand that you shifted to UNESCO, the International Bureau of Education, where you work first in capacity building program for curriculum development. And what is interesting is that we see that you explore different range of programs, the program, the education program for the Maghreb, then education policy analysis and strategies section. And then to the section for of Education 2030 Partnership, Cooperation and Research. And then recently, you've been shifting towards more research and foresight. In 2016, you've been heading the Education, Research and Foresight program at UNESCO headquarters. And very recently, you started this very ambitious project called Futures of Education, Futures plural, very ambitious project to reflect the different debates and generate debate also on how education might need to be rethought in a world where there's an increasing complexity, uncertainty, and precariousness. So this is really exciting to have you here. We are looking forward to learning more about how the education environment, the Education 2030 environment, can also guide or affect our program and project proposals. And so I leave the floor to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here and to meet you all. I have one colleague that I know well, but everyone else is new. And before getting started, perhaps some of you might be wondering, Sobi Tawil, the name is Arabic, Subhi Tawil is the correct pronunciation. I might not look it immediately, but it's a mixed background. I saw a few heads that might have been wondering. What I suggest to do, and this is what I was asked to do actually, was to give a broad introduction to what we're calling Education 2030. And then we can look very broadly at implications for policy and planning. Obviously, during the course, you'll be having more technical sessions, but this is really to give you a broad introduction. So, suggesting three questions that we could look at. What is Education 2030? I mean, the term is used on and off, sometimes in association with SDG 4, sometimes on its own. Secondly, what are the key features of this global agenda, and what commitments does it imply? And finally, what are some of the broad implications for policy and planning? So I suggest perhaps we start with the first question and open up to you. Some of you might be much more familiar, some of you less. But when you hear Education 2030, what does that mean? Some of you have a very good idea, I know. A colleague of mine who's working on this day and night. Go ahead. So part of the SDG, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a set of goals and targets.
Yeah, and I think the main purpose is to provide inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all, and also free education. I think it is a part of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You've pretty much reformulated SDG 4, so the goal on education and the commitment to ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education for all. Anyone else on? Yes.
No problem. I can shout, you know. No, actually, as I'm also have some experience in planning, and actually the SDGs, it is for the quality of education, for sustainable education for the coming 15 years, I think, because we finished the education for all. It was, I think, 2 years back. So we started for SDGs for planning for coming 15 years. So what is education 2030? It is, I think, how to plan for good and equal education. It is the fourth in the SDGs, fourth goal in the SDGs.
Correct.
So it is. I think what is education 2030.
Absolutely. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. The SDG 4, it's besides the quality and inclusiveness, it's also got an aspect of lifelong learning.
Absolutely.
It was some of the targets in the IFA were not met by most of the countries. So it still covers some of the targets that the countries had not yet achieved, and some new targets. Thank you.
Yeah, right. So two things that you've mentioned which are important. Lifelong learning, which is part of the formulation of the goal, but also the fact that some of the EFA targets had not been achieved, and Education 2030 accounts for that. But maybe I can ask you now, we will get to it a little later because both of you last two have mentioned it. What is the difference with EFA? SDG 4 and Education 2030, how does it differ? As a global agenda, how does it differ from EFA? Any thoughts?
Oh, okay. Well, for me, I just refer to it as a Millennium Development Goals, if I may, was really about the access to education. And I think access has increased a lot, but now it's really on the quality. And I think that's very important. Then also the fact that first it was aimed at primary education mostly, and now it's secondary and also tertiary and life learning, as was just mentioned before.
Right.
And then just the fact that now you have different sub-targets, well, just like for the other SDGs. And I think also, became, wouldn't say more measurable, but there's more that is being measured than before.
Right. So a larger scope and more ambitious. Okay. Any last thoughts on that? Okay, if not, let's move on. We'll come to some of these points. But to begin with, we could say that Education 2030 reflects a vision. At UNESCO in 2015, we published Rethinking Education, which was a reaffirmation of UNESCO's holistic integrated view of education. Reaffirming the fact that education is not just instrumental and an instrument of economic development, but that education has multiple purposes and responds to economic, but also social, civic, personal, and collective ambitions. In the run-up to 2015 and the adoption of the 2030 agenda, there was a set of discussions about the future. It was both retrospective, looking at the experiences of the MDGs from 2000 to 2015, but looking ahead. This was really in 2013 and 14, a set of discussions, and these were set around the backdrop of three tensions or paradoxes around global development that were recognized at that time. First of all, that there had been global reduction in poverty across the world, obviously variations by region and within countries, but globally that there had been a reduction in poverty, largely because of growth in India and China and the developments of middle classes there. But with this reduction of poverty, a recognition that there is increased inequality within countries, across countries, greater vulnerability. In many cases, growth, and this is still the case in India, for example, is characterized by low employment growth and trends in unemployment, in youth unemployment, have continued to grow. With that, also more vulnerable forms of employment and affecting job quality, in particular for women. So a first contradiction, that there had been global reduction in poverty during the MDG era, but at the same time, more inequality, greater inequality across the world and within all countries. Secondly, that there had been growth, yes, but this growth had come with continued pressure on the environment, with increasing patterns of unsustainable production and consumption. And this is, again, largely related to changing lifestyles and the growth of a global middle class. And finally, a third contradiction, that we live in a world that's increasingly interconnected, where young people are the most educated generation that we have ever had in the history of mankind, that there's greater mobility, that the internet has provided, has reduced space and time in human relations. But at the same time, although we have this young generation that is more educated, more aware, more connected, more mobile, a feeling that we live in a world that is increasingly divided, and where there are patterns of regression, populism, nationalism, division, and ultimately conflict, all undermining social cohesion. And this explains the fact that sustainability, the notion of sustainability in its three dimensions, social sustainability, economic, and environmental, was at the heart of the SDGs. So first of all, yes, Education 2030, a vision, and as was mentioned, a set of goals. A goal dedicated to education, SDG 4, but within a vision of interconnected development goals, and that given the complexity of the development challenges that we face today, the only way of addressing these challenges is by having a more intersectoral approach and interdisciplinary approach to these complex challenges. So a set of goals. Education 2030, the way we use it at UNESCO, is also to signify that it's not only about SDG 4. And let's not forget that although we are focused on education, we must be considering the comprehensive development challenges. So Education 2030 is also a set of education targets in other SDGs related to health and well-being, related to gender equality, to decent work, and to climate action and responsible consumption and production. So Education 2030 as a set of education targets within the SDGs, and obviously a dedicated goal with the set of 7 outcome targets and 3 means of implementation. And the formulation, as was mentioned earlier, is ensuring inclusive, equitable, quality education and promoting lifelong opportunities for all. As a vision, as a global set of goals and targets, Education 2030 is also a monitoring framework, a set of indicators to monitor progress. And here you have, we won't go through them in detail, but just to say that at the global level, for each of the 10 targets within SDG 4 are a set of global indicators. So the first one on ensuring free, equitable, quality primary and secondary education for all. We see the indicators in terms of minimum proficiency levels. So this focus on quality, which is new, a new focus, a new emphasis, let's say, on quality, which we did not have with the MDGs. So the share of minimum proficiency levels at different stages of schooling, grades 2 to 3, end of lower secondary, and many would add also end of secondary cycle, which did not end up in the global indicator. Someone also mentioned free. This is something that is often overlooked, and we see that in terms of the global indicators, there is nothing that focuses our attention on this commitment to free education. It's probably one of the strongest commitments of SDG 4, but the one that is largely overlooked. So that's just to give an example of the global indicator framework, basically 1, in some cases 2, indicators for each of the 10 targets. So Education 2030 as a vision, as a global goal, but as part of a set of 17 interconnected goals, explicit linkages between education and other goals, gender equality, decent work, health and well-being, climate action, and SDG 4 particularly with its 10 targets and its global indicator framework. So key features and commitments of Education 2030 SDG 4. We heard a focus on quality. What are some of the other characteristics, focus areas, and commitments of SDG 4?
I think based on the scope of the SDG 4 and one of its the differences from the EFA was a focus on the post-basic education and trainings, that EFA was only focusing on the basic education, but SDG 4 has a broader view and perspective, so it focused more on post-basic education as well.
Right, so broader scope going beyond primary. Yes, in the back.
They also provide inclusive education that is equitable.
All right.
And the IFA put more focus on universal primary education, but for SDG 4, they've included early childhood education.
We've included post-primary and we've included early childhood. Yes?
While microphone is near, SDG focus on the technical and vocational education, which is part of post-basic as well, but with a specific reference to technical and vocational education.
Absolutely. So going beyond the primary, including post-primary, secondary education, general, but also technical vocational skills development. Yes?
There is a part of SDGs, I think it's 4C, which looks at the inputs, the teachers, the water, electricity, availability.
Absolutely. Looking at the school environment also in terms of infrastructure, equipment, facilities, looking also at teachers. We often speak about education and neglect teachers in our discussions. Any last? Yes?
I think one of the main features of SDG is or to differentiate from the FA and also MDG is those two were for the middle income countries, but this is a universal commitment, I think. Yeah,
Very
is
good.
the big difference between these things?
Absolutely. One could say that the MDGs, EFA is a slightly different story, but the MDGs could be equated with, to put it in blunt terms, the rich man's agenda for the poor man. The North, the agenda of the North and the framework for international cooperation between countries in the North and the South. And that the SDGs and the 2030 agenda is a universal agenda. And having sustainability at the heart implies that it must be an agenda for all countries, regardless of development status. So here you have, just to summarize some of those differences between MDG 2, devoted to education, that was the framework for those focused on education, and the scope was primary education, and so therefore on children in particular. EFA, running at that same period between 2000 and 2015, was a focus on basic education. Basic education can be understood in different ways, but I think in the EFA spirit initially, it was not only about formal or schooling, but the idea of basic education for all children, youth, and adults. Actually, the commitment that was made in EFA was to meet the basic learning needs of all children, youth, and adults. MDG 2, on the other hand, was a focus on primary education, on children. SDG 4, as we have heard, it's about basic education, the unfinished EFA agenda, but also about post-basic education, about early childhood, the post-basic, both secondary, technical, vocational, even higher education, and in a lifelong perspective. So the scope is entirely different. In terms of coverage, and this is what you just mentioned, that the focus of MDG 4 was on low-income countries, the idea of ensuring universal primary schooling, primary education, initially focused on access and gradually more on completion, but still focused on primary education in low-income countries. EFA was universal in intent, but in reality, it also became a focus on countries in the South. But the intent was to say the commitment to meet the basic learning needs of all children, youth, and adults. And we know that even today in 2019, even in developed contexts, that we have large shares of the adult population which are considered to be still functionally non-literate or illiterate. So it was universal in intention, EFA, but it became also focused, much like the MDGs, on low-income countries. SDG 4, on the other hand, as you pointed out, is a universal agenda for all countries, both North, South, regardless of development status. And in terms of policy focus, and some of you have mentioned this, the MDGs and MDG 2 was really a focus on access and completion. EFA had a focus on quality, but it was challenging to define quality, to monitor it, to define the indicators to ensure better quality. In SDG 4, it's access to quality, so it's re-emphasizing the idea of quality in basic learning, and we have seen it in the discourse around the learning crisis, that many kids may attend school, may complete the primary cycle, may even complete the lower secondary cycle and not acquire the foundational skills. But SDG 4 goes beyond that. It is also about the relevance of learning. And this is perhaps what is perhaps the most innovative aspect of SDG 4 in terms of a global agenda that is focusing on the relevance of learning. It's not only acquiring the foundational skills, but is what we are learning relevant, and not only for the marketplace and for jobs and for securing employment, but also for civil, social, and political participation. Target 4.7, for those of you who are familiar, often framed around global citizenship education and education for sustainable development is about the social and civic dimensions of learning, which is the first time we see it in a global education and development agenda. So key features: universality, reaffirming the principles of human right, but also of public good and shared responsibility. We heard about public-private partnerships. Yes, it's a collective responsibility education, but governments, as a public good, have a fundamental obligation in ensuring access to quality, equitable education and learning for all. The scope and expanded access, it's basically the entire education system, if you want. It's early childhood, it is the full schooling cycle, it's vocational technical, it's post-secondary, it's forms of non-formal education. And that makes it partly challenging when we speak about SDG 4, because it can be equated with the entire education system in any context. Policy focus, a renewed focus on equity. It's not new, but it's being re-emphasized that equity and inclusion should be the central policy lens, gender equality being an important dimension of that, but not the only one. A renewed focus on quality in terms of effective acquisition of basic skills, that we should be in an educational cycle and actually learning something, learning the basics. But the new focus really on the relevance of learning, both for decent work, but also for social and civic life. Some of you may be familiar, and if you're not, you should have a look at the Education 2030 Framework for Action. It was adopted just several months after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda. It sets out the visions and the vision and principles around Education 2030, presents the goals and the targets, but also proposes strategic approaches for each of them. And then in the third part, a number of broad implementation modalities around governance, accountability, around monitoring, around financing. And then finally, you will have in the annex of the Framework for Action, the global indicator framework, and the more detailed thematic framework indicator framework to monitor progress. Maybe a last word about the targets, and this is what one of you had said earlier. SDG 4 is a recognition that somewhere the EFA commitments were not met. So there is an unfinished agenda. And in terms of commitments, some of the targets are really targets and commitments to ensure that all have access to a full cycle of primary, secondary education. There is a commitment that at least 1 year of pre-primary should be universal by 2030. There is a commitment, not new, but to ensure gender parity at all levels, in all forms of education. And there is a commitment, which is also largely overlooked, that all youth, 15 to 24, should be literate by 2030. Now, what we mean by literate and how we measure that is another discussion. But there is a clear commitment for universal youth literacy, for gender parity. There is a global commitment for at least 1 year of pre-primary, and there is a global commitment for a full cycle of primary and secondary. So these are really, in a way, the unfinished EFA agenda, and these are what we could call targets. Other targets in the SDG 4, we might more conveniently call signposts. Signposts because they don't say where you need to get, but they tell you go in this direction. So for example, and we heard it about post-basic education and skills development. The target is ensure expanded and equitable access to post-basic and vocational. It doesn't say where you need to get. It says focus on that, expand, make sure the expansion is equitable. But the actual target needs to be set at country level in any particular context. The same for the focus on relevance of skills for work. There's some discussion that around 21st century skills, soft skills, transferable skills that are considered relevant for work globally, but much of what would be considered relevant technical vocational skills must be defined in particular contexts. You mentioned the learning environment, ensuring a safe and inclusive learning environment. So beyond infrastructure and facilities, it's also about safety, absence of bullying, absence of violence, absence of targeting educational personnel and facilities in times of conflict. Again, there is no clear target that is set for 2030, but what SDG 4 is saying is this needs to be an area of focus. And then in terms of teachers, and this was also brought up, ensuring adequate teacher recruitment, training, working conditions, but no specification on what that means. There is no global target for that. In any particular context, that would have to be defined. Finally, implications for policy and planning. That's what you're here for, this training course. Perhaps more the planning part, but it is a cycle. One can say policy is about making decisions and planning is about implementing them. Any thoughts on what would be some of, from your areas of work, and I've heard different areas that you're working in, what would some of the implications be for policy and planning? Yes?
The first implication is on cost, money.
All right. Would you like to say more? It's the magic word, but you have to say a little more.
Okay. Looking at the SDGs, there are some things that were not included, like formally in the MDGs, the FR goals, like focus on inclusive education, including children with disabilities, to integrate them into schools where the other kids also go. So like the schools also now need for infrastructure to have child-friendly schools. So that's going to be a cost implication on the schools, like to the government, just to cite a bit of the cost implication.
Right. Yes.
Taking the stock of the global agenda, the country needs to adapt the plan and policy into the global objective, because those are global objective, but specific country need to also elaborate their own target and policy depending on the global agenda. And that's require also integrate those plan and policy action into the planning and budgeting, and looking on the way of those action are going to be financed either from local resources or support from different development partners.
Okay, so we've heard costs and financing, but also the need to adapt and translate some of the global targets into national targets and benchmarks to reach them.
Just like, of course, the events before the development, rethinking of our own strategies, local strategies at the country level, at all levels. Because I think why we are talking about maybe the government policies and the implementation part, but I think governments have also to make sure that they take stock of their own capacities at all levels.
Right.
So in other words, it's not a question of who does what, but what is it that I can do, contribute. So it gives opportunity or a challenge, as a matter of fact, to everyone to participate in the implementation. It's not like, you're just waiting for the partners to help you,
right,
but even to do your own evaluation because these ones, the relevance aspect of the SDGs is supposed to be contextual.
Yes.
So it's not just a question of, copy and pasting the SDGs from elsewhere, but it's really adapting to your country level and see how the policies are really going to be effective in your own context.
Absolutely. And we said in terms of, that it is a universal agenda. It applies to all contexts. I mean, issues of youth disengagement and dropout from secondary education are challenges even in the North, in Latin America, a great challenge. Multiple reasons for that: economic, early marriage, domestic responsibilities, family responsibilities, but also an issue of low perceived relevance of learning by young people in many contexts. In Latin America, I was just looking recently in a survey, 40% consider that they get bored in secondary education. So, I mean, there is the effort of the government and its partners but there's also a fundamental question about taking stock of where we are, not only in quantitative terms, but also what are we doing and what are we producing with this education? In the Arab world, for those who are, some of you are very familiar, we have very high rates of unemployment, the highest youth unemployment rates, and it's been like that for 3 decades. I mean, this is also an incentive for young people and their families and communities to invest in education or not. So a commitment to 12 years needs to be 12 years of meaningful, relevant education. And we do need to take stock if we are, on what is feasible, what is the capacity at all levels, and how to engage diverse partners. Yes. And then.
Also, some of the consequences of this version is most of the country are trying to adjust, to amend education policy as well as education regulations and laws, so as to fit for the purpose of these visions. Thanks.
Absolutely, and one of the first ones is national legislation around compulsory education. That's legislation. Reality might be another thing, but it's already a very important message to say in terms of legislation. This is the duration of compulsory education being considered as the minimum foundation that we need today to work, to keep learning, for further education and training. In the past, in the industrial model, primary schooling was sufficient, and still some countries in the world do have 5 or 6 years of compulsory education, but many are more like 10, 12, some up to 15 years of compulsory education. It's already a sign of, in terms of adapting legislation, that this is considered what the time required to acquire the basic foundation you need to participate economically, socially, in civic life in today's world. There was...
discussing about the implication of for policy and planning. I wanted to say the first, it is the research, isn't it? Research, analyzing the situation where it is, then fix up a policy, and then you plan for it, then you add the indicators and all. So this is what I want to say, instead of going in details now where we went here.
No, so absolutely. So that's part of the taking stock is a sector analysis, sector diagnosis, including taking stock of capacities at different levels and of different partners. There's also a research element in understanding, for example, patterns of unemployment, patterns of disengagement and dropout. What are the factors that explain that? It's not all about more education and greater access, but also understanding the social and economic dynamics that determine demand for education, private demand for education. I think there was...
I'm just not adding something rather than just asking maybe a question, or there is a question regarding the policy and the planning, because we see a lot of policies written in different countries, but when it comes to the planning or implementation of this policy, it will be difficult. And sometimes there's no linkage between what is actually in the field and what is written in papers. How this linkage can be addressed in a way that the policies really can be easily implemented in reality?
That's a big question, and we would. But I think you might be discussing that throughout the course, and based on your different experiences. But I mean, one thing that brings up, and based on my experience in the Maghreb countries, in Mauritania, and Morocco, and Algeria, is it. I mean, there's a technical dimension for planning, but there's other realities also, political and lack of coordination very often between. In some of my experiences, there were demands for technical assistance, which I don't think were genuine demands for technical assistance from the national partners. The problem was often one of lack of coordinated effort between different departments. So there's a range of issues. Just to say that technical is important, but technical is also conditioned by a number of other factors. Let's just run through some of the main implications based on the features and the policy areas. The fact that it's an agenda with sustainability at its core requires that we go beyond a silo approach to education. Again, it's easier said than done. And that we have intersectoral coordination at country level. Easier said than done, because even a system-wide and sector-wide mechanism is often lacking in many contexts of education. And often what we call the education coordination mechanism is actually part of the education system and not the entire education system. And I had one good example of efforts towards a system-wide coordination actually came from Mauritania, which have, very poor levels of performance in education, but they did have a unit that actually sits in the Ministry of Social Development that oversees the planning and implementation of the education sector. And when any donor or partner arrives in the country, they cannot go directly to any ministry or department and start negotiating and offering and talking. They have to go to these people who have the oversight and the overview of the planning. And they have an annual review meeting, which is designed, organized by this unit of very capable people, but a small unit within the Ministry of Social Development. And at the annual review, you have 6 ministries represented. The 3 ministries of education, the different levels, but also religious affairs, women, youth, the vocational, the labor, and all the partners. So intersectoral coordination is an ambition, but I would say a condition is already a truly sector-wide mechanism for policy formulation, planning, coordination, and monitoring. I won't look at all of them, but just pick out a few. Renewed focus on equity. We could see that in 2 ways. I mean, one could be in strategies that are targeting particular groups of learners or communities that are disadvantaged, but also earlier on in a more inclusive policy dialogue. The more inclusive the policy dialogue is, this will obviously be conditioned by the nature of the political system and how decisions are made. But to the extent possible, the more inclusive the policy dialogue is, the more legitimate any education strategy and reform effort is. Then in terms of strategies, obviously it's a focus on targeted strategies. We mentioned the issue of cost and the need for other partners to come in. This is largely accepted, but there is still a responsibility of national authorities to be ensuring, regardless of the degree of non-state engagement in education, whether communities, civil society organizations, private business partners, there's still a responsibility of the central government to set the standards, to ensure quality, and to protect and enhance inclusiveness and equity. In terms of effective, a renewed focus on quality or effective acquisition of, there are different aspects to that, obviously, teacher training and development, but also curriculum and curriculum review. This is an opportunity in many contexts to be also reviewing curricula content to ensure that methods and content are relevant. A lot of it is now being encouraged and driven by this target 4.7 on sustainable education for sustainable development and global citizenship. So looking at how we deal with diversity, how we combat discrimination based on gender, strengthening respect for human rights principles, but also knowledge and understanding about societal issues and development challenges. And the new focus on the relevance of learning can be looked at in different ways. In terms of monitoring, the central focus on quality, the central focus on equity and inclusion also implies more disaggregated data. And this is a challenge now in looking beyond national statistics of ministries of education and trying to look at different data sources where we can try to get more information and data about patterns of take-up of education based on different criteria, whether income, going beyond gender and region, and looking at income and looking possibly and potentially at minority status. I'll stop here. This was to give, and I think you will have a copy of the presentation on the platform. But this was to give you just some of the broad implications in terms of policy and planning. Each one of them could be looked at in more detail, and I think you have really a range and a wealth of experience here. You could be focusing on different aspects of this and the implications, either in terms of policy, program design, monitoring, in the work that you're involved in. Yeah, sure. I think there are a few minutes for any comments or questions.
Thank you, Sumi. Well, perhaps I could start with my own question or perhaps reaction, because we often hear communication about SDGs and SDG 4 more like a set of goals for countries, right? But in the context of this course, right, we're going to prepare proposals mostly from a national perspective aimed at donors. And so could we say, or how right are we when we say that SDGs and SDG 4 are also an agenda for donors? And basically, if a donor fits under the umbrella of the goals, then it adds a bit of legitimacy, let's say, to the experience, and also facilitates this dialogue between the country and the donor.
I think you're right. I think that's true, and it has always been true of global agendas. It was the case for the MDGs. It was the case for the poverty reduction strategies. In any proposal that was made to a donor, you had to refer to a national poverty reduction strategy. Somewhere you would have to refer to the MDGs at the time. If you were talking to UNESCO, maybe to EFA in particular. But it's true. It's still expected to have some reference to what are now universal collective commitments towards sustainable development. So in terms of education, it would be the central policy focus on equity inclusion, I think, would speak to donors. The focus on quality. So improving either learning assessment systems, the use of data from learning assessment systems, teacher training programs, reviewing curriculum, school leadership and management. So anything that is looking at quality, broadly speaking, and then also more specifically in terms of relevance of learning for work or relevance of learning for broader. So I think to bring it down, it's still a framework that would be referred to, and in broad terms, the commitment to equity and inclusion at whatever level and whatever context and whatever types of populations you're working with. The focus on quality in general, of actually learning the basics, acquiring the basics, and then a focus on relevance, either through skills development and preparation for the world of work, or relevance of learning for a world that's increasingly interconnected. We're confronted with environmental issues, where we are confronted with increasing diversity, mobility, migration. So all around, the 4.7 is also an attractive area. How that translates, for example, into financing would be, a focus on more equitable financing. In learning assessment, that we're not only improving levels of learning assessment, but that we're ensuring that learning outcomes, as monitored through either national exams or learning assessments, are also more fairly distributed socially, that the gaps between different groups of learners is also diminishing.
You mentioned something about the meaningful of education, especially when it comes to the policy and the implementation of that. Is the indicators of this Vision 2030 has something to link the education outcomes with the labor market? Because usually the people, or mostly the people, when it looks at education, they look at it as a tool to link to the market and to get a decent jobs or work. How you can see the indicators in this vision that addressing this thing or measuring the success of the outcomes of the education? If you get my...
Yeah, I think in the global monitoring framework, there probably are no indicators on that. There's indicators in terms of youth who are not in education, training, or employment, and monitor that. But that's just giving an idea of this, the scale of the out of school, out of training, out of work. But it does. There are no indicators to my not in the global monitoring framework that look at the relevance of training for securing employment. So looking at, for example, vocational education and kind of more longitudinal studies about integration in the marketplace and how long that would be other types of research which are not quite and would have to be context specific, which are not included, not referenced in the global monitoring framework.
Thank you very much. Among us, the implications that are raised, I've not seen anything to do with data, because it's one of the biggest challenges to analyze the context of the country, and also to develop policy and plans, and also monitoring. And given the length of the targets in the SDGs, I think it's really important that we include data improvement, OMS improvement in the implications.
Yeah, definitely. Data, the quality of data that is collected, the level of disaggregation, the use of data, and then the whole question of also capacity and the need to strengthen capacities. One of the main implications in terms of better data is better exploitation of other sources of data. And this traditionally ministries of education do not do. They will go with the administrative data that they collect, and let's say youth surveys, labor market surveys, household living standard surveys, health surveys, household health surveys also contain important information on important data on patterns of education, training linked to the labor market, but produced by other entities. A statistical division elsewhere, a Ministry of Planning, And the whole challenge becomes how these teams can start to work together. It's also a change of mindset for planners in ministries of education who typically work with administrative data that they collect. But there are other sources of data, and this is definitely a challenge. And it's not only about more and better data, it is also about better use of data. In many cases, we see data collected administratively or otherwise, presented, and I've seen this in countries I've worked by national authority. They're presented, but they're not quite fully analyzed. I mean, they're presented, but you don't quite, and you know, maybe some of the mid-level planners in ministries don't always have that sufficient capacity to look at, I mean, what is the data telling us? What's the pattern? And then once you have the pattern, how do you explain it? And then there you have to look at other sources. But you're absolutely right that data and the focus, I mean, there's two aspects of that to come back to the equity and quality focus. Equity is better quality data, but more disaggregated to be able to understand, monitor inequalities and disparities in education, and therefore to better design strategies to address them. And in terms of quality, much of the discussion is about learning assessment data, whether from national assessments or cross-national assessments. But again, that's not the whole story of producing that data, but what do they tell us and how do we act upon them? How does that translate into curriculum design? How does that translate into the training of teachers and school managers? So you're absolutely right. Data is a central issue for these two policy lenses, equity and the quality.
So a first challenge was just raised, and I was interested in knowing what other challenges you see, or the main challenges you identify to meeting Education 2030, the targets.
Well, I'll be provocative in part of the response, at least. Much like EFA, and we saw that when I tried to differentiate global targets and signposts, some of the targets are not targets. It tells you go in this direction, so there's nowhere to reach. So when we say, you know, we will not reach that target, there is no set endpoint to reach. When we say expand access, you know, to vocational post-secondary education in an equitable manner, there's no target. And in EFA, we had the same. I mean, we had gender parity, that was clear. We had universal primary education, that was clear. The indicators are clear. The target is clear. Reduce adult illiteracy by 50%. Clear. You know, you can take the national starting point, but you need to show that you've made an effort of 50%. But other targets, for those of you who are familiar with EFA, I mean, there was a target on ensure that all young people and adults have the relevant knowledge and skills they need. Exactly. There's no target. So, I mean, in the international development world, and we're part of that as UNESCO, I mean, we'll begin many of our documents by saying, if we continue in this way, we will never reach. But actually, some of the targets are not targets, so they cannot be reached. But they are important signals that give direction. So that's just the provocative parts of saying reaching or not reaching. I think one of the main challenges is one of the main commitments, it's a strong commitment, is public and free education. I mean, even the concepts need to be fleshed out. I mean, what is public today is also unclear. Right? There's a blurring between public and private, different ways that state and non-state actors, there's a range of non-state actors becoming involved in education at all levels of education and in all ways, from policy dialogue to monitoring, to financing, to curriculum design. So And then free, what does free mean? And is free tuition free? Or does free also mean an obligation for governments to overcome the opportunity costs for lower income families? So stipends, materials, other subsidies that would. That discussion is largely overlooked. I mean, that's a very radical commitment. It's probably highly unrealistic in many contexts, but it's one of the strongest commitments that, in general, is kind of overlooked. One is looking at access completion and increasingly at learning and assessment. So is quality getting better? Are we expanding? What? All very good, but what's happening when we know that privatization and for-profit education, and we have a few examples, I'm sure, in countries that, from India, from Kenya, from Uganda, from Liberia, from other contexts, where, parts of government responsibility are being outsourced, to for-profit providers. Privatization is also a loose word, but when it involves making profit and commercializing education, that discussion is happening among civil society stakeholders, but in the general kind of established international development discourse, that's not very much being looked at. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it gave me an opportunity to provide a few more thoughts.
We might quote you on these provocative statements. Yeah, so we have another question here,
Yes.
and then perhaps another.
In most of the low-income country are not yet finished maybe to implement those MDGs or even in SDG. For now, we are in Education 2030.
Yeah.
So is there any policy within Education 2030 that allow to use as a reference for those targets that the country, especially low-income country, are not yet finalized as to rely on, especially on writing a project?
Yeah.
Is there any loophole to rely those targets, which is not yet finalized, on maybe on EFA or MDGs on Education 2030?
Yeah. I think in developing any proposal, it's got to be a response to the needs of the context. Global agenda, what is a global agenda after all? What are global goals and our global commitments? Nothing is binding. I'm not saying, it's not, it's collectively, it kind of gives us all energy to say, we believe, in a number of principles and commitments and directions, and that collectively we're making efforts to get there or to go in that direction. But there's nothing, even the monitoring and the reporting on that, is just to help create a sense of responsibility in moving forward in this collective direction. But the context has to define what is important. If we look at Chad with lower than 40% primary school enrollment, what are we talking about when we say 12 years of free public schooling for all? It's just unrealistic. So it doesn't mean that the agenda needs to be thrown away. But I think if we keep to equity needs to be the central policy focus, and that there is a focus on quality, actually learning the basics, but also looking at the relevance of learning. The focus then in any context can be on whatever the challenge is. Is it still at the level of basic schooling? Is it at the level of vocational? Is it at, so there is room. What I'm saying is there is room, not for interpretation, but in a way, the SDG 4 can seem overwhelming. It's like, everything. But I think it's important to reduce it to the main commitments equity and not efficiency. Equity must be the central policy focus in education. And those implications in terms of data, in terms of monitoring, in terms of deployment of teachers, in terms, and quality. Quality, again, learning the basics. I mean, that overcoming the learning crisis, but also a new focus important on the relevance of learning. Then, in the proposals you make, I mean, it's based on the context and the national goals and priorities that, whether it's at the basic level, whether it's, for combating adult illiteracy. I mean, whatever the focus may be, there is room to do that. Given that these equity and quality are guiding the lens.
Thank you. Thank you. So one last question, if you
Sure.
allow. Thank you, Rana.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My question about the obligation of the countries, there's no obligation in ancient declarations, such as many declarations. That's right? So there's no bonding for the countries.
No, I mean, there's no monitoring and reporting and sanctions that follow. No, in that sense, it's not binding. No.
Okay, there's many countries actually made progress in education for all, but suddenly faced many challenges. Like, for example, the Arab country from 2011, they faced the revolutions. They are busy with conflicts.
Yeah.
So, are there any helping project or program to support them or to get them back to the track of 2030 education?
I mean, the Arab world is, like all regions, a very diverse region. I mean, there are many universes within the region. I mean, you have the Gulf countries, leave Yemen. You have the Gulf countries and the Emirates and whatever that are aspiring to become Singapores. And then you have the conflict affected. You have the disaster in Yemen and in Syria and repercussions on Lebanon, on the education system, that it actually is now receiving more Syrian students than Lebanese students in the public education system. And so, I mean, just what, pressure on the system. And then you have a set of countries that are more or less stable. I mean, at least not conflict affected, but not quite wealthy like the Gulf countries. I mean, I think Morocco, Algeria, Jordan. So the realities are very different. I mean, there are programs that are looking, specifically at conflict affected, and that is framed. I mean, that link with 2030 is ensuring the right to education for refugees, displaced, and migrants. I mean, focused in that way on the equity issue. In other countries, the ambitions are all very different. Tunisia, I mean, just because you mentioned Tunisia in the beginning of the uprisings, when they started, some argued that this was a sign of the failure of Arab education systems, because there's such high youth unemployment, graduate unemployment, and I'm not convinced, because I mean the uprisings were not so much about unemployment, but about dignity and more open politics and against corruption. But one could say that, I mean, over time, in these more stable contexts, the Tunisian education system was successful in producing a generation of young people who were educated and who could become informed. And their critically mobilizing was not something they learned in their education systems that were controlled by a single party and an authoritarian. I mean, critical thinking and independent judgment was not something that was being promoted by formal education, but they learned this outside. And the internet helps, and social media, but they did develop critical. So in a way, the history of the Tunisian education system was a success in 1960s. It was a country where 85% of the population was illiterate. Now you have a country, and most countries which are relatively stable, you have 80% who are literate, and a young generation that is very literate. That has been a success. That the system failed to control the minds of young people is probably a good thing. They learned the critical thinking, you know, and the critical processing of information and mobilizing and a sense of solidarity and taking action. They learned that outside of schools and universities. So the failure was a good thing from that side, and the success was the access to literacy and you know and basic skills.
Thank
I'm
you.
going off track, perhaps.
No, it's fine. I mean, I always say that a good planner is not someone who can actually draw a plan. A good planner is someone who can actually draw plan A, plan B, and then plan C,
Yeah.
and then find their way to have a success. So thanks for all these comments. Thanks for all the interactions, the questions, and thanks to you, Sobi, for the insights. Looking forward to
pleasure,
2030. Also going back a bit to the past, but to help us better understand how we can influence the future. So thanks a lot. Please join me in thanking Sobi.
Thanks.
So as for us, we will take a short break, about 20 minutes break. There are restrooms, coffee machines on the ground floor, so just one floor up. So I invite you to rest a bit and come back into this room in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Sure. Is the next session?
It is. He had to speak, so we could wait until he was finished and then we'll speak.
Okay.
I hope he didn't put you a bit.
Well, I'll see. I mean, it was not, you know, it was unclear whether I should attend or not. But recent meetings last week, I was